Before there was war, there was the sea. And before there were empires, there were two shores that faced one another across its soft blue distance: Rome, steady and patient on the western edge of Italy, and Carthage, quiet and shining under the North African sun. Between them stretched the heart of the Mediterranean, a sea both generous and watchful, carrying trade, ships, and the whispers of ambition from one horizon to another. The year was around 264 before the birth of Christ. The world was smaller then, but it felt vast to those who lived within it. The maps were incomplete, the distances long, and the winds unpredictable. Across that middle sea, two very different peoples lived and grew, each believing in their own calm way that time itself was on their side. On the northern shore stood Rome, a republic of farmers and soldiers, built not in haste but in endurance. Its power did not come from wealth or brilliance, but from patience, the slow, deliberate layering of effort upon effort, as brick rests upon brick until it becomes a wall. The Romans were practical, sometimes plain, but beneath that simplicity lived something deeper, a quiet faith in order, in law, in the rhythm of duty. Each morning, as the sun rose over the 7 hills, the city came alive with the sounds of daily life. The ring of hammers in the forges, the murmur of the Senate's debates, the footsteps of citizens crossing the forum, their sandals echoing softly between the pillars. Farmers from the countryside arrived with baskets of grain and fruit. Merchants sold oil, wine, and wool beneath the shade of canvas awnings. Soldiers trained in the Campus Martius, their shields clattering like muted thunder. Rome had been at war before, many times, with neighbors, with rival tribes, with kings long since forgotten. But those were wars of necessity, fought close to home. Rome's heart was still a landlocked one, beating to the rhythm of fields and roads. The sea, for all its mystery and promise, was something distant, a horizon known more by rumor than by reach. Far to the south, beyond the curve of the sea, stood Carthage, the daughter of Tyre, the queen of trade. Her harbors curved like crescents into the coast, her ships moved like shadows across the water. Founded centuries earlier by Phoenician sailors, Carthage had grown not through conquest, but through commerce. She did not march across the earth, she sailed upon it. Her wealth came not from soil, but from distance, from the movement of spices and glass, of metals and grain, of ideas that passed from one shore to another like gentle waves. Her merchants knew every port, every wind. Her coins bore the image of a horse's head and the palm tree, symbols of strength and life, of movement and endurance. Where Rome built with stone, Carthage built with sails. Where Rome ruled its land with legions, Carthage ruled its seas with fleets. And where Rome trusted the discipline of citizens, Carthage trusted the wisdom of traders. Yet for all their differences, they shared something, a quiet, growing certainty that the world was not yet finished. Each, in its own way, felt destined to expand, to bring its order to the places where distance still lived. They did not yet know they were rivals. They were merely neighbors across a shining sea. Between them lay Sicily, an island of green valleys and rocky coasts, caught in the sunlight like a pearl in the center of the sea. Its hills smelled of olives and wild thyme, its harbors deep and calm. To sailors, it was a haven, to soldiers, a prize. For centuries, Greeks and Phoenicians had shared its shores, sometimes in peace, sometimes in tension. It was here that the two great powers would first meet, not by plan but by accident. But before that meeting came the years of quiet growth. In Carthage, at dawn, the docks were already alive. Sailors loaded amphorae filled with olive oil and wine, the clay still warm from the kilns. The air smelled of salt and cedar. The sun rose slowly over the harbour, lighting the tall masts of hundreds of ships. The city stretched inland in orderly rows, its walls strong, its markets wide and full of color. The people spoke in many tongues: Punic, Greek, Egyptian, Iberian, a soft murmur of trade and exchange. In Rome, mornings began with the sound of water splashing from public fountains, the voices of women bargaining for bread, the faint hum of priests chanting in temples. The Tiber flowed past the city, slow and muddy, carrying small boats loaded with goods from upriver farms. Above it all, the Capitoline Hill stood like a patient guardian, its temples catching the first light of day. Rome and Carthage did not hate each other. There was no blood between them, no insult, no old wound. If their leaders had spoken across the sea in those early years, perhaps they might have found friendship. Both valued strength and stability. Both saw the world as something to be organized, guided, and improved. Yet beneath those calm similarities lived a quiet, invisible tension, the kind that exists not between enemies, but between reflections. Each saw in the other a mirror of its own nature, order, discipline, endurance. And mirrors, by their nature, can only exist side by side for so long before one tries to step through. In those days, Rome's senators spoke of land, of law, of citizenship. Carthage's council spoke of routes, of profit, of ships. The Mediterranean listened, and somewhere in its depths, the tides began to change. It began, as so many great struggles do, not with an army but with a misunderstanding, a small city calling for help, a treaty read differently on each shore, a gesture of aid that would become an act of war. But that would come later. But now the sea was calm, and the world was still balanced between two dreams, one built of stone, one built of sails. The sun set over the western horizon, laying gold across the waters. Fishermen pulled their nets from the shallows, merchants counted their coins by lamplight, soldiers returned to their barracks, their armor catching the last light of day. Across the water, the same sun sank behind Carthage's walls, and the same stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky. And between those two shores, the sea, timeless, patient, knowing, whispered softly to itself, as if it already understood what the world did not, that the calm before history is never truly still. Sicily, in those days, was a world unto itself, green, sun-warmed, and surrounded by the soft rhythm of the sea. From the air, if one could have seen it, it would have looked like a leaf floating between two great trees, Rome to the north and Carthage to the south. The island's valleys were rich with grain, its coasts bright with harbors, and its people spoke in many tongues, Greek, Punic, Latin, the sound of trade and mingling that had shaped it for centuries. To sailors, Sicily was a resting point, to merchants, a crossroad. But to soldiers it was something else entirely, a key. Whoever held Sicily could watch both sea and land, could control the routes that connected east and west. It was not the heart of the world, but it was the hinge upon which the world's doors quietly turned. At the northern tip of the island lay Messana, a small city built upon a hill that looked out across the narrow strait toward Italy. The waters there were swift, the currents restless, and the wind sometimes changed without warning. On a clear day, one could see across to the mainland, the green ridges of Calabria, the villages that dotted the coast, the faint silver line of Roman ships traveling along the shore. Messana had been founded by Greeks, but by this time its people were a mixture, soldiers, traders, wanderers from every corner of the Mediterranean. Among them were a group of mercenaries called the Mamertines, men who had once been hired as protectors, but had stayed as conquerors. They were strong, clever, and restless, a small band who held the city for themselves, claiming its harbor and walls as their own. To their west, across the island lay the city of Syracuse, older, larger, and proud. Syracuse had been a power in Sicily for centuries, a city of philosophers and warriors, temples and fleets. Its ruler, Hiroteku, was a man of caution and experience. He had seen many small fires grow into large ones, and he preferred to put them out early. When the Mamertines began raiding the countryside, taking food and silver from nearby towns, Hiro gathered his army and marched north. He moved not with rage, but with the steady rhythm of a man who knows the cost of delay. The Mamertines, seeing the strength of Syracuse's army, realized they could not hold Messana alone. And so they looked outward across the sea for help. To the west, they turned their eyes to Carthage. To the north, to Rome. Two powers, each distant, each cautious, yet each watching Sicily with quiet interest. Carthage was nearer. Its ships crossed the narrow sea with ease. Its admirals understood the winds and harbours of the island better than anyone. When the Mamertines sent envoys, Carthage listened. It was a small matter, a garrison, a few ships, a foothold. Nothing that looked at first like a war. A Carthaginian fleet sailed into Messana's harbour and anchored beneath the city walls. Soldiers disembarked, calm and disciplined, their bronze helmets glinting in the sun. They spoke little, set their camp in order, and raised the Carthaginian standard above the gate, a tall staff bearing the horse's head, the symbol of their city. It was meant to be protection. But protection, as the world would learn, is often the first shape that power takes. To the Mamertines, it was both safety and a cage. They soon found themselves surrounded not by enemies, but by allies who would not leave. Carthage had no reason to abandon such a place, a high-walled city overlooking the narrow passage between Italy and Sicily. From there, their ships could watch everything that moved through the strait. Yet in their caution, they had misjudged Rome. For years, Rome had stayed out of Sicilian affairs. The island was across the sea, beyond the reach of its legions. But when the Mamertines, desperate and divided, sent another embassy north, Rome listened. They came not as conquerors, but as clients seeking aid, invoking old ties of friendship and the promise of allegiance. In the Senate, the debate was long and quiet, and some senators argued that Rome should ignore the call, that crossing the sea would bring unnecessary risk. "The gods gave us the land," they said. "Let others keep the waves." Others disagreed. They saw opportunity. If Carthage grew stronger in Sicily, its ships might soon appear along Italy's southern coast. And if Rome ignored the plea for help, it might look weak in the eyes of its allies. It was not greed or anger that decided them, but that same Roman habit of reasoning, of weighing the world like a ledger, each entry balanced, each risk measured against duty. At last the decision was made. Rome would go to Sicily. The Senate's decree passed quietly, without fanfare. Ships were ordered built, not grand triremes like Carthage's, but small transports, enough to carry the first legions across the strait. The men who were chosen were nervous. Few had sailed before. The sea was an unfamiliar field, and the wind a poor substitute for soil. But Rome, once it decided to move, moved as it always did, steadily, carefully, and without turning back. When the first Roman soldiers landed in Messana, they found the Carthaginians already there. The two forces looked at one another across the city walls, neither expecting, neither ready, but both aware that history had quietly shifted beneath their feet. A meeting was arranged, and words were exchanged, words of alliance, of protection, of rights. But the tone was cold. The Carthaginian commander refused to leave. The Roman consul refused to withdraw. Both believed they were acting in defense, both certain that reason was on their side. There was no declaration, no trumpet, no speech to mark the moment. But when the first spear was thrown, It landed not just in Sicilian soil, but in the long memory of time. The First Punic War had begun. It began not as thunder, but as a whisper, as so many great conflicts do, born from small fears, careful choices, and the quiet meeting of two powers who each thought themselves patient enough to avoid disaster. That night, the sea between Italy and Sicily was still. The stars shone clearly above the strait. In the harbours of both Rome and Carthage, men slept beside their ships, unaware that their lifetimes would now unfold beneath the shadow of this quiet decision. And on the island itself, under the soundless gaze of the moon, the olive trees swayed gently in the wind, indifferent, as nature always is, to the struggles of men. The Romans had always been people of the earth. Their strength grew from it, from furrows ploughed straight, from roads that stretched steady and unbending across the hills. They understood the weight of soil, the firmness of stone, the discipline of marching in rhythm across the land. But the sea, the restless, glittering sea, was something different. When the First Punic War began, Carthage ruled the waves as Rome ruled the fields. Her ships filled the Mediterranean like leaves on a pond. Her sailors could read the wind by touch, could hear the tone of the sea, and know when a storm was coming. The very idea of challenging Carthage on the water seemed, to many, a kind of madness. Yet Rome, once it began something, did not know how to stop. The first Roman expedition to Sicily had crossed the narrow strait with borrowed ships, small transports, guided by Greek pilots. They were enough for that first step, for the foothold in Messana. But soon the Romans saw that if they were to hold Sicily, they would have to meet Carthage where she was strongest. And so, for the first time in its long history, Rome began to build a fleet. There was no grand proclamation, no song of sailors beneath the forum. The order came quietly from the Senate, and work began along the coast. In the shipyards of Ostia and the southern harbours, carpenters who had never built a warship learned by imitation. Greek artisans were hired, Carthaginian vessels were studied, and men who had spent their lives on farms found themselves shaping curved timbers for hulls instead of straight ones for fences. It is said that Rome built its first fleet by copying a single Carthaginian ship that had run aground on the Italian coast. The craftsman took its pieces apart, measured every plank and joint, and then built dozens of replicas. Within months, where there had been none, there were 100 ships, then 200, then 3. They were not graceful. Their hulls were heavy, their decks plain, their oars uneven. To Carthaginian eyes, they must have seemed clumsy, like oxen trying to dance. But the Romans were not seeking elegance. They sought function, a way to make the sea behave like land. They trained their men on dry ground, setting up long benches where oars could be pulled in rhythm. From morning to dusk, the soldiers rowed in the dust, learning the motion by muscle before ever feeling the push of water. It was an odd sight, soldiers who had spent their lives marching across stone, now rowing beneath the Italian sun, the dry air filled with the sound of wood striking air instead of water. When at last the ships were launched, the sea accepted them slowly, with the indifference of something ancient watching a new creation. The oars dipped and rose, splashing awkwardly at first, then more evenly until the sound became steady. The ships moved as one. Rome at last had learned to float. But even with ships, the Romans knew they could not win by imitation alone. The Carthaginians had generations of sailors, the Romans had none. And so they sought to change the rules of the sea itself. They invented something simple, almost crude, yet entirely their own. A bridge called the corvus, meaning raven. It was a wooden plank, long and narrow, hinged at one end and fitted with a heavy spike at the other. When a Roman ship drew close to an enemy, the the corvus would be dropped, the spike biting into the opposing deck. The ships would lock together, and what had been a naval battle would become a land battle, something Rome understood very well. With this invention, the Romans turned the sea into a kind of floating plain. Their soldiers crossed the corvus as if stepping from one field to another. They fought as they always had, shoulder to shoulder, shield to shield, their movements slow and deliberate. The waves might toss the ships beneath them, but the men above stood steady. The first great test came off the coast of Mylae near northern Sicily. The Carthaginian fleet approached with confidence, its sails bright in the sunlight, its movements graceful and assured. The Romans waited in a line, their ships heavy, their new contraptions ready. When the Carthaginian ships closed in, the first corvus dropped. The spike struck deep into the enemy's deck. Roman soldiers rushed across, shields high, their armor flashing. The sea filled with the sound of steel, with shouts and splashing, with the cries of men thrown into the water. It was chaos, and yet within that chaos the Roman method prevailed. One by one, the Carthaginian ships were boarded, captured, and pulled aside. The wind that had carried their pride now carried the smell of salt and smoke. When the battle ended, 50 Carthaginian ships had been taken or sunk. It was the first great Roman victory at sea. Across the waters in Carthage, the news was met with disbelief. A people of farmers had defeated the lords of the sea, not through seamanship, but through invention, patience, and discipline. The Romans did not celebrate loudly. They built more ships. They trained more men. They improved the corvus, making it lighter, stronger, easier to raise and lower. Their minds turned as steadily as their oars. But the sea, as they would learn, does not forgive the impatient. Storms came, sudden, violent, and without mercy. The Mediterranean, calm by day, could change its face by night. Fleets that had sailed confidently in the morning could be scattered by evening, their timbers broken, their men clinging to wreckage in the dark. Rome would lose many ships in these storms, more to weather than to battle. Yet even as they rebuilt, they did not retreat. For every fleet lost, another was built. For every storm endured, another voyage began. Slowly, painfully, Rome learned the sea, not as an enemy, but as a teacher. By the third year of the war, sailors from Sicily and Greece were training alongside Roman soldiers. The oars moved more evenly now. The ships turned more gracefully. The corvus, once crude, became a symbol of adaptation, proof that even an empire of land could learn the rhythm of waves. At sunset, when the ships returned to harbor, the sea turned gold beneath their hulls. The sailors' faces were salt-streaked, their arms sore but their eyes steady. The Mediterranean, once a barrier, was becoming something else, a road, a promise, a mirror of Rome's growing reflection. And so the Republic at Sea was born, not in triumph, but in persistence. The sea had once been a stranger to Rome, an uncertain horizon that shimmered just beyond the reach of its legions. But by the 4th year of the First Punic War, it had become something familiar, no longer a mystery, but a patient teacher. The Roman sailors, who had once flinched at the roll of the tide, now moved easily upon it. Their hands were calloused, their rhythm sure. The sea still demanded respect, but the fear had gone. In its place there was purpose. At dawn, the harbours along Sicily's northern coast stirred awake. Ships swayed softly against their moorings, ropes creaked, gulls circled above. The water reflected the first pale light of morning, the colour of worn silver. Soldiers gathered quietly on the docks, adjusting armour straps, sharpening blades, speaking in low voices that blended with the sound of waves. Among them stood Gaius Julius, a Roman consul, not a sailor by birth, but a man of patience and order. He had studied reports of Carthage's fleet, examined captured ships, and learned the rhythms of the wind as carefully as he once studied the formation of infantry lines. He understood that Rome's victories would come not from skill, but from discipline, the same discipline that had carried them across Italy, across rivers and mountains, and now across water. The Carthaginian fleet, confident as ever, sailed along the coast near Mylae. Its ships were sleek and fast, their oars moving in perfect harmony. The sea seemed made for them. Their admirals watched the Roman ships with quiet amusement. The Roman vessels were heavier, slower, and covered in strange wooden contraptions, the Corvus boarding bridges that had puzzled sailors from every port. When the two fleets met, the wind was light, the sea calm. The Carthaginians advanced in a long curve, their ships spreading wide to encircle the Romans. The sunlight caught their bronze rams, turning them to lines of fire upon the water. The Romans did not move. Their ships held formation, heavy and still, as though waiting for something unseen. The first Carthaginian ship lunged forward, confident in speed, aiming to ram and retreat. But before it struck, the Roman captain dropped the Corvus. The iron spike bit deep into the enemy deck with a sound like thunder. The two ships locked together. From the Roman vessel, soldiers crossed as if stepping from one shore to another. They moved in formation, shields up, swords drawn, steady and unhurried. The Carthaginian sailors, unaccustomed to fighting hand-to-hand, fell back. The sea, which had always been their ally, was of no use here. More ships followed. One after another the Corvus fell, and one after another the Roman legions crossed the planks. The sea that had once separated them now joined them, ship to ship, deck to deck. The battle, once fluid and quick, became solid. The sea turned for a moment into land. When the fighting ended, the Carthaginian fleet withdrew in confusion. The water was scattered with wreckage and broken oars. Roman ships floated in tight formation, their sails catching the soft afternoon breeze. Above them, the new Roman standard, the eagle of the Republic, gleamed faintly in the sun. It was the first true victory of Rome at sea. Back in the city, the news spread like the sound of distant thunder. Messengers arrived dusty and sunburned, their words measured but full of awe. The Senate met in quiet satisfaction, the people gathered in the forum, listening as the news was read aloud. They spoke not of glory, but of progress, of how Rome, without tradition or experience, had faced the masters of the sea and prevailed. Duilius was honoured not with gold or spoils, but with something quieter, a procession through the streets where citizens offered flowers and applause, and a column was raised in his name. The first columna rostrata, adorned with the bronze beaks of captured ships. It stood in the forum for centuries, a reminder that patience can conquer even the elements. But the sea, ever restless, did not remain kind for long. The following year, Rome built a new fleet, larger, stronger, its timbers seasoned, its oars reinforced. The shipyards along the Tiber worked without pause, and soon hundreds of new vessels stood ready. They sailed to Sardinia and Corsica, small islands caught between Rome and Carthage, like quiet witnesses to history. The wind carried them swiftly, and victory followed again. Carthage, however, was not a city to despair. Its admirals learned as Rome had learned. They adjusted, adapted, and watched carefully. Their new commander, Hamilcar Barca, was a man of quiet fire, patient, cunning, a master of endurance. He began to strike not where Rome expected, but where Rome was weak. He harassed the coasts, ambushed supply ships, and vanished into the sea before pursuit could find him. Rome, bound by its sense of order, struggled against such unpredictability. Battles were fought, lost, fought again. Fleets sank in storms, were rebuilt, sank once more. Yet each loss seemed only to deepen Rome's resolve. The Senate did not weep for ships, it commissioned new ones. The citizens did not fear the waves, they grew accustomed to them. Each victory, however small, carried meaning. It was not the size of triumph that mattered, but its direction, forward, always forward. The sea was becoming Roman inch by inch, not by dominance but by endurance. In the harbours of Sicily, the air changed. The people began to speak Latin words alongside Greek and Punic ones. Roman laws, Roman weights, Roman coins, they crept in quietly like the tide at dusk, reshaping the edges of life without anyone noticing at first. For the first time in history, Rome's shadow stretched across the water. When the ships returned to port, the soldiers, now sailors as well, sat by the fires eating bread and olives, watching the sun sink into the horizon. They spoke softly of home, of family, of fields left untended. But they also spoke of the sea, how it moved, how it breathed, how it seemed to test and teach them at once. They had come to understand what Carthage had known for centuries, that the sea is both master and companion, cruel and kind, endless yet intimate. And in that quiet understanding, Rome began to change. The Republic was no longer just a city of hills and rivers. It had become something broader, a presence upon the water, a new rhythm in the world. The wind that once separated Rome and Carthage now carried their names together across the same horizon. One would not rest until the other fell silent. But for now, the sea, calm and silver under the moon, belonged to no one, only to time. Victory, when it came, did not sound like thunder. It arrived softly, in the creak of ships returning to harbour, in the tired footsteps of men walking down gangplanks, in the long silence that follows the end of noise. The sea, that patient witness to everything, was calm again. The waves that had carried fleets to battle now washed gently against the shore, indifferent to who had won or lost. Rome's first triumphs at sea had proven what no one had believed possible, that a people of farmers and roads could master the waves. They had beaten Carthage in open water, not through elegance but through will. And yet, the victory did not feel like joy. In the harbours of Sicily, the ships were scarred. Their hulls bore the marks of rams and fire, their sails were patched and salt-stained. The men who climbed down from them moved slowly, their faces darkened by sun and fatigue. They spoke little. Triumph, they had learned, was heavy to carry. The Roman consul sent reports home, brief, factual, precise. They listed ships captured, harbours taken, cities pacified. They spoke of discipline, of courage, of the Republic's growing reach. But between the lines, though no ink marked it, lay something else, the cost of keeping victory alive. For the sea had begun to take its toll. Storms came without warning. Off the coast of southern Italy, a fleet returning from battle was caught in one such storm. The wind rose first, low and steady, then quickly turned violent. Waves struck from every side, the sky went black. The sea, once a path, became a wall. The Roman ships, heavy and square, were not built for grace. The same solidity that had made them strong in battle made them helpless against the wind. One by one, they capsized or broke apart, their oars shattered, their masts snapping like reeds. Thousands of men were lost, soldiers, sailors, craftsmen, slaves. When morning came, the shore was littered with wreckage and bodies, the sand darkened with salt and grief. Rome did not weep long. It rarely did. The losses were counted, the dead recorded, the shipyards ordered to begin again. And to Rome, Rebuilding was a kind of prayer, a ritual against despair. New fleets rose from the ruins of the old, the hammer's ring replacing mourning. But in the quiet corners of the Republic, a weariness began to grow. Families who had given sons now gave brothers. Those who had given brothers now gave fathers. The war was no longer a distant event whispered about in the forum. It was a shadow that stretched into every street, every field. Carthage too felt the burden. Her harbours, once alive with trade, now stood half empty. Ships that had carried goods now carried soldiers. Merchants watched the sea with unease, knowing that every voyage risked loss. The wealth that had once flowed like water through Carthage's markets now trickled, uncertain and slow. The war had begun over a single city, a misunderstanding on an island. But years had passed, and the cause no longer mattered. The struggle had become its own reason, a rhythm that neither side knew how to end. On Sicily, the land itself bore the scars. Fields once full of wheat lay trampled beneath camps. The roads were lined with broken wagons, the bones of mules bleaching in the sun. The air smelled of smoke and iron. Farmers ploughed again where they could, their hands steady, their eyes on the horizon. They did not speak of Rome or Carthage. They spoke only of weather, of seed, of survival. The soldiers, when they could, found moments of peace. In the evenings, they sat beside the sea, cleaning their armor, sharing bread, listening to the waves. They spoke of home, of vineyards and olive trees, of the sound of children in the courtyards, of the warmth of familiar light. Some sang softly, old songs from the hills, their voices carried out over the dark water like whispers. And still Rome built ships. Each one was a promise, a defiance, a statement written in oak and bronze that no storm, no loss, no grief would undo what had begun. The Senate funded new fleets, the carpenters worked through the night, and the oarsmen trained again, the same motion, day after day, like prayer beads moving through fingers. The years blurred together. Victories and losses balanced like scales. Cities fell and were retaken. Fleets sank and were rebuilt. The war became less a story of glory and more a test of endurance. Sometimes, when the nights were quiet, the soldiers looked up at the stars and wondered if Carthage's men across the sea were doing the same. They fought one another, but they shared the same winds, the same sun, the same salt upon their lips. In another time, perhaps, they might have traded goods, shared wine, spoken of weather. But war turns mirrors into walls. As the war dragged on, even the commanders grew older. The names of consuls changed with the seasons, but their duties remained the same: to hold, to fight, to endure. Duilius's column still stood in the forum, its bronze rams shining faintly in the Roman light, but few stopped to look anymore. Victory had become familiar, and so had loss. In Carthage, the council debated peace, then war again, then peace again. They sent envoys, received none. The sea between them and Rome, once bright with trade, had turned into a graveyard. The sailors, who had once sung while loading ships, now worked in silence. And yet, through all of it, there remained a strange, quiet dignity, a shared understanding between two civilizations that neither could yield without undoing itself. Rome could not return to being small. Carthage could not stop guarding the waves. The war, in its weary persistence, had become part of them both. When the wind blew from the west, it carried the smell of pine and resin from Italy to Africa. When it blew from the south, it carried the scent of salt and spice from Africa to Sicily. Each could smell the other, even across distance. The sea, wide and eternal, seemed to sigh with them, the sigh of something ancient watching two children fight beneath the same sun. And so the war continued, not with the fire of beginnings, but with the long, slow burn of endurance. Rome, steady and unswerving. Carthage, patient and proud. The sea, endless and knowing. History does not often remember fatigue, but if you listen closely, if you slow the noise of centuries, you can still hear it there, in the calm between battles, in the weary rhythm of oars, in the way the waves touch the shore and pull back again, as though counting the years. By the middle years of the First Punic War, the sea had grown quiet again, not in peace, but in pause. Both Rome and Carthage had begun to tire. The waves that once carried fleets now reflected only clouds and gulls. The shipyards along the Tiber stood still for the first time in years. In Carthage, even the great harbour seemed to rest, its round docks filled with ships half-mended and waiting. The war had stretched across more than a decade. Rome held parts of Sicily. Carthage still ruled the sea. Between them, the balance hung by a thread woven from endurance alone. In Carthage, the council met behind closed doors, the air heavy with the scent of oil lamps and parchment. The city's elders, merchants and generals argued softly, not of pride or vengeance, but of exhaustion and necessity. They spoke of the years lost, of the coffers drained, of sailors and soldiers who would never return. And yet, for all the weariness, there was still one name that carried hope, a quiet, steady name that promised endurance. Hamilcar Barca. He was not loud nor given to ceremony. He did not speak of glory but of patience. And where others saw loss, he saw lessons. He had watched Rome's rise with a soldier's eyes and a father's caution. In him, Carthage found not fire but gravity, the kind of calm that steadies an entire nation. When Hamilcar was given command, he did not march in triumph. He left the city at dawn, his cloak plain, his expression unreadable. His soldiers followed him out through the western gate, the sky pale with early light. They carried little, spoke less, and moved with the quiet precision of men who had seen enough of war to know its cost. He did not choose the open sea. He chose the mountains of western Sicily, where the land met the water in steep, rugged cliffs. There he built his camp, not to attack, but to endure. From those heights, he could see everything, the distant glimmer of Roman sails, the smoke of their camps along the plains, the winding roads that carried their supplies. He watched and he waited. Rome had grown used to battles fought openly, legions meeting legions, fleets facing fleets. But Hamilcar fought differently. He did not seek great victories. He sought survival through persistence. His men struck swiftly, vanished into the hills, reappeared miles away. They raided supply lines, burned depots, ambushed patrols. It was not the war of generals, it was the war of shadows. At night, when the fires of both sides flickered across the valleys, his soldiers moved silently through the dark, guided by starlight and memory. They struck, withdrew, and melted back into the land. The Romans called him the Fox of Sicily, a name spoken with both frustration and respect. The sea below his cliffs was his lifeline. Carthaginian ships slipped in and out of small coves, bringing supplies and reinforcements. The Romans, tied to their heavy fleets, could not follow. And to them he was a ghost, seen only when he wished to be. Years passed this way. Each spring, Rome sent new commanders, new plans, new fleets. Each autumn, storms returned and washed them away. The war had begun as a contest of ambition, but under Hamilcar, it became a test of endurance, a kind of patience that neither side could abandon without surrendering its pride. Hamilcar's soldiers came to respect his calm above all else. He spoke little in camp. When he did, it was in short, careful phrases, not commands but reminders. "The land waits for us," he would say. We fight only when it speaks. He was not loved as heroes are loved. He was trusted, and in war, trust is a rarer thing. Sometimes, he stood alone at the edge of his camp, looking out over the sea. The wind pulled at his cloak. The waves moved far below, steady and endless. He thought not only of Carthage, but of what might come after. He knew that wars end, but their shadows linger, that the peace after such a struggle would not be simple nor kind. Far away, in Carthage itself, his family waited. Among them was his young son, a boy named Hannibal, who listened to the stories of his father's endurance like one listens to the voice of the sea, patient, endless, and full of hidden strength. The boy's eyes shone with quiet intensity when his tutors spoke of Rome. He was too young to understand the war, but old enough to feel its weight. In the 11th year of fighting, Rome suffered another disaster at sea. 200 ships lost to a storm off the coast of Sicily. Tens of thousands of men drowned. The Republic grieved in silence, then rebuilt again. But the rhythm of rebuilding had slowed. Even Rome could not endlessly pour its will into the sea. The Senate debated, argued, doubted. The treasury thinned. The soldiers on Sicily fought on, but their letters home grew shorter. The citizens of Rome began to speak of the war not as a mission, but as a burden. And still on his cliffs, Hamilcar watched the horizon. He fought small battles, won small victories. He kept his men alive, his camps supplied, his cause unbroken. He could not defeat Rome, but he could deny Rome victory, and that, he knew, was enough. By the 15th year of the war, the two sides had become reflections of each other, both weary, both proud, both unwilling to yield. The land itself seemed tired of them. The fields lay unplanted, the roads worn to dust. The villages along the coast had learned to live between the sounds of marching feet. One evening, as the sun sank behind the sea, Hamilcar walked the edge of the cliffs. The wind was warm, the waves below shimmered gold. His officers stood beside him, waiting for orders that did not come. At last, he said quietly, "They have learned the sea, now we must teach them patience." And so he did. Through the long years that followed, as empires strained against each other, as storms rose and fleets sank, Hamilcar remained unbroken, calm as the land itself, enduring as the tide. His war was not one of conquest, but of survival, the art of not losing when losing seemed certain. And though history would move on, and the names of other generals would echo louder, there would always be, beneath the noise, the quiet truth that it was Hamilcar who taught the world that sometimes victory begins with simply remaining. By the 17th year of the war, time itself seemed to slow. The sea, once alive with ships and ambition, now moved with a weary calm, as if it too had grown tired of watching men fight. The waves that had carried fleets now carried only driftwood. The sky above Sicily hung heavy with heat. The war no longer burned brightly, it smoldered. Rome still held the hills of the island. Carthage still commanded the waters around it. But neither could push the other away. Between them lay the thin line of coast, the same roads fought over year after year, the same towns built, destroyed, and rebuilt again. It had been so long that even the soldiers stopped counting the years. Children born when the war began were now grown. Some fought in the same fields where their fathers had died. The old men, the few who had survived all these seasons of battle, looked upon them with quiet disbelief that the same war could belong to two generations. The camps had become small cities of their own. The tents were patched and mended. The cook fires were lit in the same places each night. The men grew used to the faces around them, the routines, the unchanging rhythm of waiting. War, they had learned, was not always motion, Sometimes it was stillness that lasted too long. In the Roman camp, orders were given each morning as though they mattered. Patrols set out, scouts reported back, weapons were cleaned, armor polished. But there were few battles now, only skirmishes that ended before they began. The men fought because that was what they had been sent to do, not because they believed the end was near. In the Carthaginian camp, Hamilcar Barca still held his quiet vigil. His men had grown lean and disciplined, their movements measured and sure. They trusted him without question, not because he promised victory, but because he promised endurance. "We will outlast them," he would say. The sea favors the patient. Sometimes he sent his men on small raids, not to conquer, but to remind Rome that he was still there. They struck like wind, swift, invisible, vanishing before the dust had time to settle. The Romans grew wary, even in their own camps. The sea, too, played its own part in this long, quiet struggle. Fleets went out and did not return. Not from battle, but from storms, from winds that tore the sails and waves that broke the hulls like toys. The Mediterranean had become the third combatant in the war, impartial and endless. When ships sank, no messengers carried the news. The sea did not announce its victories. Only the absence of letters, the silence of harbors told the story. Back in Rome, the war had become a weight that pressed upon everything. The treasury ran low, taxes rose, farmers who had gone to war never returned to tend their fields. The city still functioned, markets opened, the Senate met, festivals continued, but behind every act of normalcy lay the tired rhythm of waiting. The orators spoke of honor, of perseverance, of the destiny of Rome. Their words carried over the forum like smoke, thin and persistent. But even the most loyal citizens felt the quiet truth in their hearts that the war had grown larger than purpose. It existed now because neither side could imagine the world without it. In Carthage, life continued under the same strain. Merchants sailed cautiously, their routes shorter and fewer. The market still smelled of olive oil and cedar, but the crowds were thinner. The council met in low voices, aware that the cost of holding the war was slowly bleeding the city's spirit. And yet, Carthage had always been a city of endurance. Its walls had stood against storms before. It would not yield. There were still moments of beauty amid the fatigue. On calm nights, when the wind fell and the stars appeared, the sea seemed to forget the quarrels of men. Roman sailors, lying on their decks, would look upward and see the same constellations that their enemies watched from the opposite coast. Orion, steady in the south, the Pleiades, faint and clustered. The sky, at least, belonged to neither Rome nor Carthage. Sometimes, when the wind carried just right, they could even hear the faint sound of voices across the water, laughter, songs, the small comfort of human noise. For a moment, it was easy to imagine that the two camps were not enemies at all, but distant reflections of each other. Years passed this way. Rome sent new consuls, new fleets, new taxes. Carthage sent new envoys, new commanders, new plans. But the shape of the war did not change. It was as though history itself had fallen asleep, its breath slow and steady, its eyes closed upon a story that could not yet end. Somewhere in the hills of western Sicily, a Roman soldier, weary, scarred, older than his years, once wrote a line in the dust beside his campfire. "The war waits for no man, but it waits with all of us." No one knew his name. The words vanished with the wind by morning. But they captured the truth that lived in every soldier's heart, that the greatest test of men was not battle, but the long, uncertain quiet that followed it. In Carthage, Hamilcar grew older. His beard turned grey, his patience deeper. His son, far away, listened to the stories of the war and learned its lessons not through glory, but through the endurance of his father's example. In Rome, senators grew old and died. New ones took their place and repeated the same speeches. The city itself grew in silence. More temples, more roads, more ambition. The world did not stop turning, but it turned slowly. And beneath that slow turning, the war lingered, not as movement, but as gravity. The olive trees of Sicily still blossomed in spring. The wheat still grew tall and golden in the fields. Life continued, quietly and stubbornly, between the footprints of armies. It is strange, perhaps, that the longest parts of wars are the quiet ones, not the battles that fill the pages of history, but the spaces between them, the years of waiting, of marching without purpose, of living day by day beneath the same weary sky. In those spaces, Rome and Carthage came to resemble each other more than either would ever admit. Two great powers, both bound by pride, both learning the same truth, that endurance is both a weapon and a wound. And so the war continued, year after year, with no sound but the sea, steady, eternal, whispering softly to both shores. Enough, enough. But neither side could yet hear it. The war had lasted so long that men had begun to think it might never end. It had become a season of its own, not spring, not summer, but a long grey dusk stretched across 2 decades. The olive trees of Sicily had grown and been harvested many times. Children born beneath the sound of war drums were now men grown beneath the same sound, unchanged. And yet, slowly, quietly, the tide began to shift. In the city of Rome, where the Tiber wound gently through its crowded streets, there came a kind of still determination, the calm that follows exhaustion but refuses to surrender. The Senate no longer spoke of glory or vengeance. They spoke of completion, of duty done. The war must end, they said, not for pride but for peace. Carthage, too, felt the same truth. The years had drained its strength. The great harbour that had once been filled with hundreds of sleek, bronze-prowed ships now lay half empty. The sea had become heavy with ghosts, sailors lost to storms, to time, to memory. The merchants had returned to quieter trades. The shipwrights, once busy with the craft of war, now repaired fishing boats instead. But Rome was not finished. Under the guidance of new leaders, men younger, unburdened by the defeats of their fathers, the Republic prepared for one final effort. No grand army, no great host of legions, only ships. For Rome had learned over these long years that the sea was no longer their enemy, but their measure. They turned to private citizens for aid. Wealthy families funded ships out of their own fortunes. Farmers gave timber, blacksmiths gave tools, the Senate gave permission, and the people gave everything else. It was not commanded from above. It was built from below, plank by plank, a fleet born not from power but from endurance. In the spring of the 23rd year of the war, the new Roman fleet, 200 ships, strong and simple, set sail from the coast of Sicily. The wind was light, the sea was calm. The men aboard were veterans, most of them older now, their faces weathered by years of salt and wind. They did not cheer as they left the harbour. They knew too well what waited. They simply bowed their heads and rowed. Across the water, Carthage watched and prepared. Her own fleet, rebuilt but diminished, gathered at the Aegates Islands just off Sicily's western coast. The islands were small, dry and sunlit, rocky shapes rising from the deep blue sea. Between them, the final battle would be fought. The morning of that battle came with soft light. The sky was pale, the horizon gold. The sea moved gently, the way it often does before turning violent. The Carthaginian admiral, Hanno, looked out from his flagship and saw the Roman sails approaching. His ships were fewer but faster. They carried seasoned sailors, men born to the sea. His confidence, though quiet, was certain. But the wind was not on his side. It blew hard from the west, filling the Roman sails and pushing them forward, while the Carthaginian ships struggled against it. The gods, it seemed, had tilted the sky itself. When the fleets met, the air filled with the deep rhythmic thunder of oars. The Roman ships, their sails taut with wind, closed the distance quickly. The Carthaginian vessels turned to meet them, but the waves were heavy, and the water churned beneath their keels. The Romans had stripped their ships of everything but what mattered: armor, grain, and will. They carried no cargo, no weight to slow them. Their oars struck in perfect rhythm, and when the distance closed, the Corvus bridges dropped one by one like the wings of iron birds. The sound was terrible and soft all at once: the thud of iron, the scrape of wood, the cries of men, the hiss of the sea as it took another ship. Carthage's sailors fought with desperate grace. They turned, maneuvered, struck and withdrew their ships faster and lighter. But the wind and the waves betrayed them. For every Roman ship that sank, 2 more came forward. The Corvus fell again and again, and each time it did, another Carthaginian vessel was taken. The battle lasted for hours, though those who survived later said it felt like a single long moment. When it was over, the sea was scattered with wreckage, broken hulls, shattered oars, floating barrels, the faint glint of armor beneath the water. The Roman commander, Gaius Lutatius Catulus, stood at the bow of his ship and watched the horizon. The wind still blew steady at his back. The sky was clear. Around him, his men stood silent, their faces pale from salt and sun. They did not cheer. They simply watched the same sea that had taken so much and now at last had given something back. Far to the south in Carthage, word of the defeat arrived days later. The harbour was quiet that evening. The sun sank over the breakwaters, turning the water red and gold. In the council hall, the elders sat long after the messenger had finished speaking. No one shouted. No one wept. They only listened to the sound of the sea outside the windows, the same sound their ancestors had heard when the city was young. They knew the truth before the words were spoken. The war was over. Envoys were sent to Rome. The peace that followed was not cruel, but it was heavy. Carthage was to give up Sicily, to pay tribute, to withdraw its ships. The Republic, in its quiet pride, accepted with little ceremony. There were no parades in Rome that year, no great feasts. The people were too tired, the Senate too cautious, the soldiers too aware of what had been lost to call it triumph. The fleet returned to the Tiber, their sails torn, their decks scarred. The veterans stepped onto the docks like men returning from a long illness. They had won, but the cost of victory was written in every empty seat, every name no longer spoken. And yet, beneath all the exhaustion, there was something unspoken, a change so deep it would not be understood for centuries. Rome had touched the sea and found that it did not break them. The Republic, that had once been a city of farmers, now ruled the waters that had once terrified it. Carthage, proud and silent, withdrew into itself. It repaired its harbours, rebuilt its fleets, and waited. And somewhere in that same city, a young boy, Hannibal, the son of Hamilcar, listened to the sound of the sea as his father spoke quietly of Rome. The boy's eyes were calm but bright, reflecting not fear but understanding. He did not yet know what shape his life would take, but the sound of the sea stayed with him, steady and endless. The war was over. The silence that followed was not peace, but a pause, the deep, echoing inhale before the next storm. For though the sea had chosen its victor, the horizon, as always, waited. When the war ended, it did not end with trumpets or parades. It ended the way long storms do, quietly, almost uncertainly, as though the world was afraid to speak too loudly in case the thunder returned. The sea, which had carried so much struggle, grew still again. The wind softened. The wreckage of ships drifted to shore, and the waves took back the rest. The harbours of Sicily were calm for the first time in a generation. Fishermen returned to the water with cautious hearts, their nets touching places that had seen too much iron and blood. Rome and Carthage at last had signed peace. The treaty was simple and heavy. And Carthage would surrender Sicily, pay tribute over many years, and keep its ships away from Italy's shores. Rome, in turn, would allow trade to resume and the world to breathe again. But peace, when it came, was not the same as rest. In Rome, the news was received with a quiet sense of disbelief. 23 years of war had changed the city. It was no longer the same Rome that had set sail for Sicily so long ago. The children who had watched their fathers leave were now adults. Some of them had children of their own. The city had grown larger, wealthier, more complex, but also harder, more certain of its strength. The Senate met to give thanks to the gods. The temples filled with offerings, the altars bright with garlands. Yet even as the prayers rose, they sounded tired, like the voice of someone speaking out of habit. Rome had won, but victory, when stretched across so many years, no longer felt like triumph. It felt like relief. The veterans returned in small groups, their steps uneven, their eyes distant. They carried few belongings, a piece of driftwood, a coin, a scrap of cloth from a fallen comrade's tunic. The city received them with quiet honor. Families gathered in the forum to embrace what was left of their own. Some waited for faces that never appeared. The losses were never officially counted. Perhaps they could not be. The war had taken from every family, from every street. There were names carved into marble and names remembered only in whispers. Yet life, as it always does, found its way forward. The markets reopened, the builders returned to their work. The Tiber continued to flow past the city's walls, indifferent and eternal. Across the sea in Carthage, the mood was different, not relief, but silence. The city had survived, but it no longer felt invincible. The harbour, once crowded with merchant ships, lay half empty. The great circular dock, built to hold a fleet, was now a quiet pool where the wind made small ripples across the water. Hamilcar Barca returned home, older than his years. His men, few as they were, followed him through the gates in silence. The people of Carthage gathered to watch, but there were no cheers, only respect. He had not won, but neither had he fallen, and in defeat, endurance can be its own kind of victory. He was welcomed by the council with honours, but honours meant little to him. He had spent too long in the dust of Sicily, too long among men who had lived and died, for something that the wind itself seemed to have forgotten. He walked through the city slowly, feeling the ground beneath his feet, the heat of the sun, the smell of salt and smoke. It was familiar and strange all at once. In his home, a small boy ran to meet him, Hannibal, his son. The boy had grown taller, his face calm and watchful. He looked up at his father, not with the excitement of youth, but with a kind of reverence. The stories he had heard were no longer stories. They were standing before him, weary but alive. That night, as the city slept, Hamilcar stood by the harbour and looked out across the dark water. The lights of passing ships flickered faintly in the distance. Somewhere beyond that horizon was Rome, stronger than ever, patient as ever. He did not hate it. He understood it. He called Hannibal to him and pointed across the sea. "Do you see that?" he asked softly. "Yes," said the boy. "That is where they live, the men who took what was ours." "You must learn to know them, Hannibal. Not to hate them, but to understand them." The boy said nothing, but he looked long at the horizon, and the image stayed with him for the rest of his life. In the years that followed, Rome took Sicily as its own, its first province beyond the Italian mainland. And governors were sent, roads built, taxes collected. The Sicilian towns, weary from war, accepted Roman rule with quiet pragmatism. Life resumed, fields planted, markets opened, ships once again loaded with grain and oil. But beneath the calm, something subtle had changed. Rome had learned that it could reach beyond itself. The sea, once a border, had become a bridge. The Republic's ambitions, once limited to the peninsula, now stretched toward new horizons. The senators spoke of Corsica, of Sardinia, of trade routes and harbors that could feed the city's growing hunger. The victory had awakened something that would not sleep again. Carthage, bound by treaty and loss, turned its eyes elsewhere. Hamilcar led expeditions into Spain, seeking to rebuild the city's strength through new lands, new mines, new soldiers. He trained his men as carefully as before, teaching them patience, discipline, and silence, lessons learned from long years facing Rome. In time, Carthage began to recover. The markets filled again with voices. The shipwrights returned to their craft. The smell of cedar and tar once more filled the air. But though the ships returned to the harbor, the sound of them was different, less confident, more cautious, as though the sea itself had become a reminder of what had been lost. Years passed. The tribute was paid. Rome grew wealthier. Carthage grew quieter. The sea between them seemed at peace, but beneath its calm surface, something still moved, slow, deep, inevitable. The war had ended, but its echo did not fade. Sometimes, at dusk, when the wind blew softly from the north, the sailors of Carthage swore they could hear faint sounds carried across the water, the distant ring of Roman forges, the low murmur of oars dipping into water, the heartbeat of a republic that had learned to move without stopping. Hamilcar listened too, and he understood what the sound meant. Peace had come, but rest had not. And years passed, and the memory of the long war began to fade, not from the world, but from its noise. The seas grew calm again, and trade returned to its slow, familiar rhythm. The ports of Sicily filled with laughter once more. In Rome, children played in the streets of a city that no longer smelled of iron and oil, but of bread and wine. The Senate met beneath the same marble arches and spoke of crops, laws, and new roads. Life, at last, seemed to have remembered itself. But beneath that calm, history was still quietly breathing. Rome's victory had reshaped the world. What had once been a city of farmers was now the center of a growing network of provinces and ports. Ships flew the Roman standard in waters that had never known it before. Sicilian grain fed the city's markets, silver and salt poured in from conquered lands. The Republic had discovered something it had never known it possessed: appetite. With every new harvest, with every new trade route, its confidence deepened. The Senate, cautious in speech but bold in thought, began to dream of a Rome that would never again need to fear another power. They did not yet call it empire, but the shape of it was already there, quiet, deliberate, inevitable. Across the sea, Carthage lived on, proud, wounded, and patient. The city had survived its defeat, but not without scars. Its harbour, once the envy of the world, no longer glittered with fleets. Its markets were smaller, its temples quieter. Yet Carthage had always known how to endure. It turned inward, mending itself piece by piece. And at the heart of that renewal stood Hamilcar Barca. He had returned from Sicily a man of silence, respected, feared, but changed. He no longer spoke of the war, except to those who needed to learn from it. In the council, he was measured and calm, yet his eyes still carried the deep reflection of the sea. He knew that Carthage could not challenge Rome again by ships alone. If the city was to rise, it would have to do so from the land. And so, quietly, he began to look west, toward the lands of Iberia, what would one day be Spain. There, the rivers ran rich with silver, the mountains with iron, the valleys with grain. It was a place of promise, far enough from Rome's watchful gaze, close enough to rebuild strength. Carthage agreed. The expedition began as trade, as settlement, as exploration. But everyone understood its deeper purpose. Hamilcar would take an army, found new cities, and gather wealth for the city's renewal. In the marble halls of Carthage, the elders nodded. The sea might have been lost, but the earth remained. Before he left, Hamilcar made a quiet visit to the temple of Baal Hammon, the city's oldest god, the silent, open-handed figure whose stone eyes had watched Carthage since its birth. And there, among the smoke of incense and the murmur of prayers, he brought his young son Hannibal, now a boy of 9. The priests performed their rites, their voices low and rhythmic. When they finished, Hamilcar knelt beside his son. The air smelled of cedar and salt. The light from the temple door fell across the boy's face, and for a long moment, they simply looked at one another, father and son, both standing in the shadow of a city that had endured too much to forget. Then quietly, Hamilcar spoke. "You will come with me to Iberia," he said. "You will see the lands beyond the sea and learn what it means to rebuild. But first, you must promise me something." The boy's eyes, dark and steady, met his father's. "What must I promise?" he asked. "That you will never be a friend to Rome," Hamilcar said. There was no anger in his voice, only certainty. The boy nodded once. "I promise," and with those words, soft, almost whispered, a new chapter of history began to breathe. Hamilcar left soon after, leading his men across the sea once more. The fleet was small, the wind steady, the voyage long. When they landed on the Iberian coast, they found a land both wild and beautiful, mountains that glowed red in the sunlight, rivers that twisted like silver threads, plains that seemed to stretch forever. And there, Hamilcar built New Carthage, a city of stone and strength, a second heart for the nation he had served all his life. Years passed, and the boy grew. Hannibal rode horses along the hills, trained with soldiers, listened to his father speak of war not as conquest, but as patience. He learned to move through the world quietly, to wait as the sea waits, to strike as the wind strikes, swiftly, without warning, and without cruelty. Meanwhile, in Rome, the Senate spoke again of security, of expansion, of destiny. As Sardinia and Corsica were taken, new territories were explored. The Republic's walls grew higher, its roads longer. The old men of the Senate still remembered Carthage, but the young spoke of it less and less. They believed the past had been buried beneath the peace. But peace is never buried. It waits. In Iberia, the mines opened, the forges burned, and Carthage began to hum again with the sound of labor and promise. Traders carried back news of strong new armies, of wealth flowing once more into the harbor. The elders of Carthage smiled and said little, but among the younger men, the old pride stirred again. The sea between the two cities, quiet for nearly a generation, grew restless once more. The winds began to change, and in those winds, far across the water, a rumor began to move of a young general in Spain, brilliant and calm, with eyes like his father's, and a promise in his heart that would one day carry him across mountains no army had ever crossed before. He was not yet a man, but his name had already begun to gather weight. Hamilcar Barca. For now he trained and waited, learning the shape of patience. But time, like the tide, never stands still. And when the next war came, as it always does, it would not begin on the sea or on the plains of Sicily. It would begin with a boy who had once stood beside his father in a quiet temple, watching the light fall on the floor and whispering a promise that the world would one day remember.